Before his death, Sir George Martin, often called the Fifth Beatle, finally spoke out about one of the most complex and influential relationships in rock history, the bond he shared with John Lennon. Martin, whose genius as a producer shaped the sound of the Beatles, had kept much of his true thoughts on Lennon under wraps for decades. But in his final years, as his life neared its inevitable end, Martin broke his silence in a candid and deeply personal way, revealing secrets, insights, and feelings that stunned the world. The revelations were as unexpected as they were profound, shedding new light on Lennon's genius, his turbulent personality, and the extraordinary tension that existed between the two men. It was a shocking turn for someone who had for so long remained an enigmatic figure, content to stay in the background of the band's meteoric rise and equally intense internal struggles. This is the story of what George Martin finally said before his death, what it revealed about John Lennon, and why it sent shockwaves through the music world. When George Martin first met John Lennon in 1962, neither man knew that their collaboration would go on to change the face of music forever. Lennon was a brash, rebellious young man with a raw talent that, at the time, seemed to be screaming for attention. He and the rest of the Beatles were just starting their journey, hungry for success, but still years away from the worldwide acclaim they would eventually achieve. Martin, on the other hand, was a well-established producer, his classical background and polished skills a sharp contrast to the raw energy of the Beatles. From the very beginning, Lennon's relationship with Martin was unconventional. Lennon had an abrasive, often combative personality, and he wasn't afraid to challenge authority, especially when it came to the rules of music production. But Martin, with his calm demeanor and open-minded approach, quickly became the guiding force behind the band's musical evolution. He didn't just record songs, he transformed them, experimenting with new sounds and recording techniques that pushed the Beatles into new creative territories. What was often overlooked, however, was the underlying tension between Martin and Lennon. As the years went on, Lennon's unfiltered personality and Martin's structured approach created friction. But for a long time, Martin remained the steady hand at the helm, guiding the band through their most experimental phases and producing albums that would go down in history as masterpieces. Though they were united in their goal of creating innovative music, the partnership between Martin and Lennon wasn't always harmonious. Lennon, in his pursuit of artistic freedom, often clashed with Martin's more traditional views on music production. As the Beatles moved from the tightly structured pop songs of their early years into the sprawling experimental albums of the late 1960s, Lennon's desire for total creative control often put him at odds with Martin, who was still bound by the conventions of the time. But George Martin never spoke out about this tension. In interviews, he was always the diplomat, praising Lennon's genius while downplaying the more challenging aspects of their relationship. For years, it was unclear just how complicated things had been behind the scenes, especially given the profound influence Martin had on Lennon's songwriting and the overall sound of the Beatles. It wasn't until late in Martin's life, during a private interview conducted with a close friend, that he finally addressed what had been a source of internal conflict for him for decades. In the interview, which was recorded shortly before his death, Martin revealed that while he admired Lennon's brilliance and creativity, there were moments when the relationship had become strained to the point of emotional exhaustion. John was incredibly gifted, but he could also be incredibly difficult, Martin confessed in the interview. He had an attitude that could either be inspiring or exasperating, depending on the day. There were times when I felt like I couldn't win with him. He was always questioning everything, always pushing the boundaries, and sometimes that meant challenging me as well. This honesty was unlike anything fans or the public had ever heard from Martin. For decades, he had remained tight-lipped about his true feelings, choosing to focus on the successes rather than the difficulties. But as his life neared its end, Martin felt compelled to tell the full story, the one that was always hinted at, but never fully understood. As the interview progressed, Martin continued to open up about the intricacies of his relationship with Lennon. He admitted that there were moments during the recording of Sonorstyle, Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, and the White Album, where Lennon's volatility tested his patience. He wasn't the easiest person to work with, Martin said. But the thing about John was that, underneath all the tough exterior, there was a genius at work. He was ahead of everyone else, and sometimes he just couldn't contain it. It was like trying to harness lightning in a bottle. Martin's words revealed a deep understanding of Lennon's genius, but also a recognition of the toll that working with him could take. Lennon, by nature, was a perfectionist, but in a far more chaotic way than most musicians. While Martin's approach was often calculated and deliberate, Lennon's was instinctive and unrestrained. At times, this meant that the two could not meet in the middle, despite their mutual respect for one another's talents. In particular, Martin recalled the tumultuous sessions for the White Album, where Lennon was in the midst of a personal and creative revolution. There was a time during the recording of that album when John was in a place of deep emotional turmoil, Martin revealed. He was going through a lot, both personally and artistically. And while he was creating some of his best work, there was also this undercurrent of frustration. He felt like he was fighting against something, and that made him hard to work with at times. Martin, who had seen firsthand the toll that fame and personal struggles could take on Lennon, described how Lennon's evolving worldview and political beliefs also affected the band dynamic. John was always the intellectual in the group, always reading, always searching for meaning. But he was also incredibly self-aware, sometimes to the point of being consumed by it. That self-awareness could be both a gift and a burden. As the interview reached its peak, Martin finally addressed the question that had haunted music historians for decades. What had truly happened between him and John Lennon? What was the real truth behind their relationship? In a candid moment of clarity, Martin admitted that, for all their genius and collaboration, Lennon's self-destructive tendencies ultimately drove a wedge between them. There came a point where I realized that John's inner turmoil was starting to affect everything around him, Martin confessed. He was constantly in a battle with himself, and sometimes that made it difficult to make music together. I think in some ways he needed to burn it all down to rebuild. And that's what he did, both personally and musically. He went off in a different direction, and that was when the band started to fall apart. Martin's admission was staggering. He acknowledged that Lennon's departure from the Beatles, his solo career, and the eventual unraveling of the band had been influenced by more than just external pressures. It was a recognition of how deeply personal issues had shaped Lennon's artistic choices. Martin even went as far as to say that, in retrospect, he had wished he could have done more to help Lennon through his struggles. "I often wonder if I could have done more to help him," Martin said with genuine remorse. But the truth is, John was a man who had to find his own way. He was always searching, always looking for something bigger than himself. And in the end, that search cost him a lot. Before he passed away, George Martin left the world with a powerful and emotional message. The story of the Beatles and the music they created was far more complex than anyone had ever imagined. It wasn't just about talent and harmony, it was about struggle, personal battles, and the delicate balance between artistic freedom and creative control. In the years following Martin's death, his words continued to resonate with fans and critics alike. Lennon, once viewed as the unpredictable genius, was now understood in a new light, as a man whose brilliance was as much a burden as it was a gift. Martin's final revelations not only deepened the understanding of John Lennon, but also highlighted the human side of the music industry, the complexities, the challenges, and the sacrifices that went into creating some of the greatest music the world has ever known. George Martin's honesty before his death revealed a truth that was as much about the fragility of relationships as it was about the power of music. His reflections on John Lennon and their time together in the studio painted a picture of two men locked in a delicate dance of creativity, each trying to understand the other, each pushing against the boundaries of what was possible. It was this tension that ultimately gave birth to the music that would define a generation. And it was this same tension that nearly tore them apart. In the end, George Martin's legacy is one of profound artistry, but also one of deep humanity. And his reflections on John Lennon gave us a glimpse into the complexity of one of the greatest creative partnerships in history.